I never imagined that a simple Tuesday afternoon, the kind where birds lazily flit across your yard and the ice in your tea clinks softly in the glass, would descend into a full-blown suburban war. But there she was, Karen, the morbidly obese, self-appointed, tyrannical ruler of the HOA, waddling toward my front gate like a human juggernaut, her polyester blouse straining desperately against the bulging rolls of her arms and her double chin quivering with righteous fury, muttering about violations in a voice so loud and self-important it could have been heard by the residents 2 blocks over, and I immediately knew that my peaceful day of staring at my freshly pruned shrubs and ignoring the world was officially over, because in Karen's eyes, a dandelion daring to grow taller than her perfectly manicured lawn, or heaven forbid, the faint tilt of my mailbox, constituted a personal affront to her authority. I had been anticipating this encounter for weeks, quietly plotting a revenge that was equal parts ridiculous and satisfying, the kind of petty suburban heroics that would go down in local legend, and after scavenging through my garage I found the weapon of choice. A massive gallon of bright electric blue paint so vivid it could make the sky jealous, the kind that leaves a permanent mark and demands attention, which I poured into a bucket large enough to make a small child feel inadequate, stirring it with a stick like some deranged artist preparing a masterpiece of humiliation. I carefully planned the ambush, coating the exact portion of my front doorpost where Karen's pudgy fingers inevitably landed whenever she tried to pry, shove, or otherwise invade my personal space, measuring the height with obsessive precision so that her rolls and knuckles would inevitably meet the paint and leave her smudged with shame. By mid-morning, everything was set, and I positioned myself behind the curtain, gripping my phone with sweaty anticipation, ready to capture the epic fail, because HOA wars were nothing without proof of the absurdity for posterity. Soon, the unmistakable squeak of her orthopedic shoes on my walkway signaled her approach before she even came into view, and when her massive, clammy hand landed on the post, blue paint transferred immediately, coating her fingers, palms, and even a portion of her wrist as she yelped, stumbled back slightly, and left a smear up the wood like some grotesque accidental modern art installation, her eyes wide with disbelief, her face flushed crimson as she stared at the ruin she had inflicted upon her own dignity. She tried frantically to wipe her hand on her ill-fitting designer purse, only to spread the paint further across her blouse and sleeves, doubling the comedic horror of the scene while she muttered, "This is sabotage. This is illegal. I am the HOA president," in a voice quivering with fury and disbelief, yet wobbling like a precarious balloon caught in a windstorm as she tried and failed to regain some shred of authority over the situation, her rolls jiggling violently with each desperate step. I could see her double chin bouncing like a grotesque metronome, sweat glistening along her forehead, as she attempted to lift her enormous frame off the porch step and reassert dominance over a doorpost that had now become her nemesis, while I struggled to contain laughter, hiding behind the curtain and imagining the story she would tell to the other HOA members, claiming the post had attacked her, plotting imaginary lawsuits in her mind, and yet leaving a trail of blue behind her like a paint-smeared ghost of entitlement. The street fell into a stunned silence for a second, broken only by the soft snicker of the mailman who had paused mid-route to witness the spectacle, and then erupted as neighbors peeked out from behind blinds, windows, and partially opened doors, some trying to stifle laughter, others openly pointing at the absurd tableau, drawn like moths to the fire of Karen's humiliation, her waddling, flailing, flabby body creating a scene so dramatically ridiculous that it could have been scripted for a slapstick suburban comedy movie, and in that glorious moment, I realized that I had won a tiny yet infinitely satisfying victory in the never-ending war against petty HOA tyranny, because Karen, in all her overstuffed glory, had finally met her match in a simple brightly painted doorpost, and for the first time in her life she had no authority, no control, and no dignity left to protect, only the ridiculous evidence smeared across her own body and a neighborhood silently cheering me on for my artistic justice. I thought the blue paint incident would finally teach Karen a lesson in boundaries, but the very next morning, like some grotesque, wheezing avenger fueled by entitlement, sugar, and rage, she returned, waddling toward my house with a gait that suggested her sheer mass could bulldoze anything in her path, her arms flailing wildly as if conducting an invisible orchestra of anger, her double chin bouncing with every step, and I could hear her muttering, "This is harassment. This is against HOA regulations," through clenched teeth, which only made her sound more like a blustery foghorn than a human being, and I knew immediately that my suburban war had entered phase 2, the full Karen counterattack. I peeked through the blinds just in time to see her attempt to yank open my door, the very doorpost I had masterfully coated in blue, only to slip slightly on the paint streaks she had smeared the day before, leaving an even longer trail of azure across her sleeve and palm, and I could barely contain myself as she clutched the doorknob, wobbling like a whale trapped on land, muttering curses that could have gotten her banned from polite society, and then, in a desperate bid to regain authority, she decided to climb the small fence I had installed to mark my property line, her rolls jiggling violently as she attempted to hoist herself over, wobbling precariously while leaving streaks of paint on the wood, the metal, and her own thighs, which now looked like a poorly executed tie-dye experiment gone horribly wrong, and every flail and shuffle she made sent paint flying onto the porch in a manner that could only be described as accidental abstract art. I was bent over, laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face as she struggled, muttering about bylaws, trespassing, and "I am the HOA president, I am the law," like a cartoon villain desperately trying to maintain dignity while literally being defeated by a doorpost and her own obesity, and at one point she wobbled back so far that she almost fell, only catching herself on the fence with a groan that sounded like a dying walrus, leaving a streak of blue paint that looked suspiciously like a giant exclamation mark, perfectly symbolizing the absurdity of the entire situation. I could hear the faint laughter of my neighbors as they began to peek out from behind curtains, blinds, and tiny gaps in hedges, some daring to film on their phones, which made Karen flail even more in panic, gesturing wildly, her chubby fingers leaving fingerprints of shame and blue on the siding, while she shouted, "This is sabotage. You will regret this. I'm going to call the board and then the police and then the governor." All in one breath, which, given her size and fury, sounded like a foghorn on steroids, echoing across the street and making every passerby glance in disbelief at the chaos she was creating. By this point, I had strategically placed a few buckets of paint-soaked rags nearby, purely for comedic effect in case she tried to grab anything, and I imagined the mental calculations running through her head as she considered legal action while simultaneously trying not to destroy her own blouse, but failing spectacularly, leaving her a walking disaster of blue streaks and glitter from some neighborhood kid's prank earlier that week, and I couldn't help but narrate it in my head like a wildlife documentary. Observe the Karen in her natural habitat, massive, enraged, unable to understand boundaries, and entirely undone by a simple doorpost and the laws of physics. As she finally retreated, muttering threats of lawsuits, meetings, and punitive actions against me and my supposedly illegal landscaping, I realized that the blue paint had not just humiliated her, it had escalated her obsession, transformed her into a local spectacle, and inadvertently rallied the neighborhood behind my absurd, yet brilliant act of defense, because in the world of HOA tyranny, sometimes the most powerful weapon is a little creativity, a lot of humor, and a very large, very fat antagonist who cannot handle either. By the time she waddled back to her car, leaving yet another trail of blue smeared on the porch railing, I was already plotting Phase 3, a motion-activated sprinkling system, strategically placed glitter, and maybe even a little "surprise Karen" sound effect for the next encounter, because if one thing was certain, Karen was relentless, hilariously self-important, and completely incapable of learning her lesson without suffering maximum embarrassment first, and I was more than ready to provide it. By the time word of Karen's blue paint fiasco spread through the cul-de-sac, I realized I had unintentionally sparked a full-blown suburban spectacle, because nothing screams chaotic comedy like a morbidly obese HOA president waddling across private property with blue-streaked fingers and an ego the size of her, and as I watched from my window, I could see the neighborhood slowly emerging from behind curtains, garage doors, and hedgerows, some clutching smartphones to record the unfolding disaster, others whispering and pointing with barely contained glee, and in that instant, I felt a perverse thrill knowing I had inadvertently created a community-wide entertainment event that made HOA meetings look like child's play. Karen, of course, had no idea she had become a local celebrity, her double chin quivering with a mix of rage, confusion, and embarrassment as she stomped toward my porch, trying desperately to assert her authority over the very doorpost that had become her nemesis, and with every step her massive thighs jiggled like gelatin, leaving behind fresh smears of paint on the railing and floorboards as if she were personally leaving a trail of evidence of her defeat for posterity. The kids in the neighborhood, emboldened by the absurdity of the scene, started giggling uncontrollably, whispering suggestions like, "Throw glitter," and "add a bell," which made me snort behind my curtain, while a few brave adults even offered tips for improving my artistic defense strategy, none of which I took seriously, but all of which added to the surreal, chaotic energy of the moment, because Karen's over-the-top, flailing, fat-laden antics had turned a simple HOA dispute into a full-blown suburban theater production. At one point, she attempted to regain control by tapping the post again, only to slip slightly on the blue streaks she had left yesterday, spinning in a near-comical pirouette, and I could hear her sputtering, "This is harassment. I demand a meeting." The bylaws, before being cut off by the roar of laughter erupting from the neighbors, some of whom were filming her as if she were the star of a reality show, while others crouched behind cars and fences, trying desperately not to fall over in fits of amusement, and she flailed her arms wildly in response, smearing more paint across her enormous frame and inadvertently creating what looked like an abstract masterpiece of defeat, the blue streaks now mingling with the glitter the kids had sneakily thrown earlier, creating a vibrant chaos of color that screamed, "Karen has met her match." I imagined her internal monologue, panicking as she considered lawsuits, complaints, and demands for enforcement of her non-existent personal authority over my property, while simultaneously trying to wipe paint off her oversized hands, which only made matters worse, smearing blue and glitter across her blouse, sleeves, and even her cheeks, leaving her looking like a deranged carnival villain in a modern suburban nightmare, and I couldn't help but laugh so hard that I nearly fell off my chair. Feeling an overwhelming sense of mischievous triumph, because not only had I defended my property in the most ridiculous way possible, I had also united the neighborhood in silent, gleeful approval, everyone witnessing the spectacle of Karen, massive, enraged, and utterly defeated, learning for the first time in her life that power is not measured in title or girth, but in creativity, cunning, and the ability to turn a doorpost into a weapon of comedic justice. By the time she waddled back to her car, exhausted and humiliated, leaving fresh smears of blue paint across the porch, the railing, and her own massive arms, I knew the saga had reached a new level, because the entire neighborhood would talk about this for years, telling their grandchildren about the day Karen the fat HOA tyrant was defeated by a single brilliantly coated blue doorpost, and as I leaned on the fence, sipping my lemonade with a grin, I realized that Phase 4 of this epic suburban comedy would require maximum absurdity, maximum preparation, and most importantly, absolute cruelty in the most hilarious paint-smeared way possible. Karen, now fully obsessed and fueled by the memory of the humiliating blue paint incident, returned at dusk like some grotesque, waddling storm cloud, her polyester blouse stretched to the limits, her double chin quivering with fury and determination, muttering non-stop about bylaws, HOA authority, and impending lawsuits, while the neighborhood, tipped off by earlier chaos, began to gather quietly behind hedges and windows, ready to witness the next act in this absurd suburban saga, and I, having prepared the piece de resistance, stood behind the curtain with a devilish grin, knowing that this encounter would be the one that cemented my legacy as the undefeated defender of private property in the face of very fat, very angry HOA tyranny. I had rigged the doorpost with a fresh coat of glitter blue paint, strategically thickened for maximum transfer, added motion-activated sound effects that unleashed my own recorded laughter the moment it was touched, and even positioned a small bucket of cornstarch on the ground to make the inevitable slip both hilarious and dramatic, and when Karen's enormous hand made contact, the doorpost immediately rewarded her with a burst of blue streaks, glitter clinging to her folds like tiny mocking stars, and a cacophony of maniacal laughter echoing across the yard, causing her to stumble backward, squealing, tripping over the cornstarch, and leaving a perfect paint and glitter trail behind her like some sort of abstract suburban disaster painting that perfectly captured her rage and humiliation. She tried to scream, "I am the HOA president. This is illegal," but the recorded laughter drowned her out, bouncing off the siding, her rolls jiggling so violently that every flap of skin seemed to have a life of its own, leaving streaks of paint across her arms, legs, and even her face as she flailed helplessly, and I could see the absolute panic in her eyes as she realized the absurdity and inevitability of her defeat, the neighborhood's silent snickers growing louder as she waddled in circles, trying futilely to regain composure, while kids pointed, adults filmed, and even the mailman paused mid-route, shaking his head in disbelief at the theatrical spectacle. I stepped outside at the perfect moment, broom in hand like a conductor of chaos, narrating loudly for dramatic effect, "Behold, the Karen rendered powerless by paint, physics, and poetic justice," which only made her flail harder, leaving more glitter and blue streaks across the porch, railing, and her own massive frame, and for the first time she seemed to realize that her authority, her size, and her self-importance meant nothing in the face of creativity, humor, and a perfectly prepared doorpost. By the time she waddled back to her car, exhausted, smudged, glittered, and blue from head to toe, muttering threats of legal action that nobody would take seriously, I leaned against the fence, sipping lemonade as the neighborhood erupted in quiet, gleeful applause, kids imitated her flailing as a game, and adults whispered to each other about the day Karen, the tyrannical, very fat HOA queen, was defeated not by law, not by logic, but by paint, glitter, and unrelenting humor, and I realized that suburban legend had been born. A tale that would be retold at every HOA meeting, block party, and barbecue, a story of absurdity, revenge, and ultimate payback, where a single brilliantly painted doorpost had bested the unassailable, jiggling might of Karen, the very fat, very furious, and completely humiliated HOA president. Just when I thought Karen's defeat at the blue and glittered doorpost would finally bring peace to the neighborhood, she returned the very next morning, waddling like a furious walrus fueled by vengeance, her polyester blouse now stretched to its absolute limit, sweat glistening along her massive neck rolls, and her face red with a combination of rage, exertion, and pure humiliation, muttering incoherently about bylaws, trespassing, harassment, and paint sabotage, while flailing her enormous arms as if she could physically will the universe to correct the injustice done to her, and I knew immediately that Phase 5 of our suburban war had begun. This was no longer just paint, it was personal. She stormed across my yard, leaving footprints of glitter and blue streaks on the grass like some deranged parade route, wobbling dangerously on the uneven stones of my walkway while muttering threats about lawsuits, HOA meetings, and possibly bringing the state police, though I doubted even law enforcement could survive her sheer bulk in motion, and I had to stifle my laughter as her enormous backside caught on the porch railing, tilting her precariously while leaving more smears of paint across the railing, the floorboards, and inevitably herself, creating a chaotic abstract pattern that could have hung in a modern art museum titled, Karen vs. Justice. The neighborhood, fully aware of the absurdity, had begun to gather again, this time with lawn chairs, cameras, and snacks, watching in awe as Karen attempted to climb over my fence, wobbling like a malfunctioning marionette, her rolls jiggling in a horrifyingly comical rhythm while she muttered threats about fines, penalties, and my illegal decorations, and every step she took triggered small traps I had added after the last encounter. A strategically placed bucket of glitter tipped slightly, a motion-activated whoopee cushion I had tucked near the fence post, and a tiny bell that rang every time she leaned on the gate, resulting in a cacophony of sound and sparkles that made her yelp, spin, and flail so violently that she nearly toppled completely into my flower bed, leaving blue handprints on tulips and daisies alike. I couldn't help narrating the scene like a nature documentary, whispering to my phone, "Observe Karen in her natural habitat, a massive enraged creature incapable of learning, yet fully committed to a doomed assault on a doorpost and a yard, creating chaos with every flailing limb," and at one point she paused, catching her breath, only to slip slightly on the paint again, wobbling precariously as glitter rained down on her shoulders and back like mocking confetti, her face twisted in fury, disbelief, and humiliation all at once, muttering about calling the board, filing complaints, and demanding that I be arrested, while I leaned against the fence, sipping lemonade and laughing so hard that tears streamed down my face, knowing that the spectacle had reached its peak, a perfect suburban comedy of errors that the neighborhood would talk about for years. Finally she huffed, groaned, and waddled back to her car, paint smudged, glitter embedded in her hair and folds, and muttering about revenge that nobody in their right mind would take seriously, leaving behind a yard, porch, and neighborhood filled with echoes of laughter, smears of blue paint, and a newfound sense of solidarity among the neighbors who had all silently cheered for my brilliant, absurd, and utterly humiliating defense against the very fat, very furious, and completely unstoppable Karen, proving once and for all that creativity, humor, and a little bit of paint can triumph over ego, authority, and sheer mass. Just when I thought Karen's blue and glitter disaster had finally humbled her forever, she returned the very next day with a level of determination and absurdity that could only be described as cartoonish, waddling across my yard like a furious walrus on a mission, her polyester blouse straining against every roll and fold, sweat gleaming along her neck and arms, muttering about bylaws, fines, and illegal paint attacks, as though the universe owed her obedience, and I knew instantly that this would not be a repeat of prior humiliations. It was Phase 6, Karen's last-ditch, over-the-top escalation, complete with theatrics and full suburban chaos. I had anticipated this, of course, and had prepared accordingly. The doorpost was now reinforced with fresh layers of blue paint, glitter, and a hidden sprinkler mechanism rigged to spray lightly whenever she touched it, a tiny bell for dramatic effect, and strategically placed slippery tiles disguised as stepping stones, turning my porch into an absurd obstacle course worthy of a ridiculous game show, and I positioned myself behind the curtain, camera ready, suppressing maniacal laughter as I watched her approach. Karen's eyes widened when she realized she was not alone. Neighbors had gathered, some with phones, some just peeking from behind hedges, all eagerly awaiting the next round of spectacle, and this only fueled her determination, her arms flailing wildly, her rolls jiggling violently like a poorly constructed carnival float, as she tried to assert dominance over the doorpost that had already humiliated her twice, her foot landing on a slippery tile that sent her wobbling like a giant, panicked metronome, scattering glitter and blue paint across the porch in a chaotic arc, and I couldn't stop narrating in my head. Observe Karen in her natural habitat, enormous, enraged, and utterly undone by paint, physics, and suburban ingenuity. At one point she reached the doorpost again, triggering the sprinkler, which sent a mist of water over her massive shoulders and doubled the absurdity, leaving her blouse clinging comically while glitter and paint streaked down her rolls like abstract modern art, and I watched, tears streaming, as she flailed, slipped, and spun in a combination of panic, fury, and humiliation that made her look like a cartoon villain in a slapstick movie, shouting, "I am the HOA. I am the law. This is sabotage," while leaving blue and glittery fingerprints everywhere, including her own cheeks, which made her face look like a bizarre mask of defeat. The neighbors were openly laughing now, some applauding, some filming, some whispering to each other about how they had never seen such a glorious combination of rage, entitlement, and comedic failure, and I realized that Karen's escalation had done exactly what I wanted. She had turned my yard into the absurdest, funniest suburban stage imaginable, fully entertaining the neighborhood while leaving her authority in tatters. After multiple slips, flails, and near falls, she finally waddled off in a huff, dripping wet, smeared in glitter, streaked with blue paint, muttering vague threats that no one would ever take seriously, leaving behind a yard, porch, and entire street echoing with laughter, applause, and the unmistakable message that no amount of rolls, rage, or self-importance could overcome creativity, humor, and a perfectly rigged blue-painted doorpost, and I leaned on my fence, victorious, sipping lemonade, already imagining what Phase 7 of Karen versus suburban justice would look like, because one thing was certain. This battle was far from over, and the legend of Karen, the very fat, very furious HOA tyrant, and her epic failures would grow with every new act of absurdity I devised. By the time Karen returned for what could only be described as her full-blown siege of my property, the entire neighborhood had quietly gathered like spectators at an epic, absurd suburban battle, whispering excitedly behind hedges, car windows, and peeking through partially open blinds, phones at the ready to capture every glorious moment of the very fat, enraged, and increasingly delusional HOA president on display, and I, knowing that Phase 7 would be the most chaotic, ridiculous, and utterly humiliating spectacle yet, had transformed my front yard and porch into a comically fortified stage. The doorpost now coated in triple layers of bright, glittering blue paint, strategically reinforced with hidden sprinklers, a motion-activated sound system that unleashed my laughter at maximum volume whenever she touched anything, and a series of buckets, slippery tiles, and strategically placed flower pots designed to make every step she took a cartoonish misadventure, and as I peered through my curtains, sipping my lemonade, I could see her approaching like a colossal storm cloud of fury, her polyester blouse threatening to burst, rolls jiggling with every wobble, sweat glistening across her flabby arms and neck, her double chin bouncing violently as she muttered incomprehensible threats about bylaws, fines, legal action, and personal vendettas, her voice echoing across the cul-de-sac in a way that made even the mailman pause mid-route, muttering under his breath, "She's unhinged." Karen charged up the walkway with determination that defied physics, her enormous feet threatening to crush anything in their path, and the moment she reached for the doorpost, a hidden sprinkler erupted, soaking her in a dramatic arc of water while my motion-activated laughter system unleashed a booming, maniacal cackle that seemed to mock her very existence, causing her to yelp, spin, and slip simultaneously, leaving blue streaks, glitter, and water stains across the porch in a chaotic masterpiece of suburban disaster art, and I could barely contain myself as she flailed helplessly, arms waving like windmill blades, rolls jiggling uncontrollably, muttering, "I am the HOA. I am the law. This is harassment. Arrest this person," as though sheer volume could somehow override physics, paint, and public humiliation. The neighbors erupted into quiet applause, gasps, and laughter, some filming, some covering their mouths to avoid showing their amusement too openly, and a few even dared to add their own subtle contributions. A neighbor tossed a single glitter confetti popper that exploded near her feet, causing her to jump backward, skid slightly on a strategically placed wet tile, and land with a comedic thud on the grass, leaving behind yet another trail of glitter, paint, and humiliation, and at that moment I realized Karen had become a full-blown suburban caricature, an unintentional comedian whose rage, girth, and obsession with control had created the most elaborate, absurd, and entertaining spectacle I had ever witnessed. Undeterred, she tried again, reaching for the doorpost with renewed fury, only to slip on the wet patch, smack into the strategically positioned flower pot, and send a small cascade of blue paint and glitter flying onto her blouse and thighs, while the neighborhood collectively gasped, laughed, and recorded every angle for posterity, and I could almost hear her internal monologue unraveling in real time. This cannot be happening. This is sabotage. I am powerful. I am feared. I am covered in paint, glitter, and public humiliation. At one point, she attempted to reclaim dignity by turning toward the street to address the crowd of neighbors who had gathered for the spectacle, but her enormous frame wobbled, and she stumbled forward, arms flailing, rolls bouncing violently, leaving a new trail of blue and glitter across the walkway as a group of kids squealed with delight and mimicked her movements, while a few daring adults added minor traps, a strategically tossed soapy sponge, a small bucket that tipped under the weight of her foot, each contributing to the symphony of absurdity that had become Karen versus suburban ingenuity. After multiple slips, spins, flails, and what I could only describe as a full performance of humiliation art, she finally huffed, wheezed, and waddled back to her car, soaked, glittered, painted, and muttering vaguely about retaliation that nobody would ever take seriously, leaving behind a yard, porch, and neighborhood echoing with laughter, applause, and incredulous whispers. And as I leaned against the fence, sipping my lemonade and watching the chaos settle into a bizarre, triumphant calm, I realized that the legend of Karen, the very fat, overzealous, completely humiliated HOA president, had reached its peak, a story of ridiculous creativity, suburban drama, and absurd justice that would be told and retold for years, a reminder to all that sheer arrogance, girth, and self-importance cannot withstand paint, glitter, ingenuity, and a healthy sense of humor. By the time Karen returned for what could only be described as her grand finale, the neighborhood had fully mobilized, like spectators at the absurdest Olympic event ever staged, hiding behind hedges, lawn chairs, and partially open garage doors with cameras, phones, and popcorn, ready to witness the showdown that had become legend. And I, knowing this would be the most dramatic, humiliating, and side-splittingly funny encounter yet, had transformed my yard into a suburban fortress of chaos. The doorpost layered in triple coats of blue paint and glitter, sprinklers strategically rigged to soak anyone foolish enough to touch it, motion-activated sound effects blaring my laughter at full volume, strategically placed slippery tiles and small, harmless obstacles, and even a few creative surprises designed purely for comedic effect, turning my porch into a living, breathing, absurdist stage where Karen, the very fat, very furious and increasingly unhinged HOA queen, would be the star of her own humiliation. She approached like a waddling tornado of rage, polyester blouse straining, sweat gleaming across her folds, muttering endlessly about bylaws, fines, and illegal sabotage, while flailing her enormous arms with the kind of energy only fueled by pure indignation. And the moment she touched the doorpost, the entire setup activated in glorious unison. Sprinklers erupted, soaking her massive frame. The sound system unleashed a booming, maniacal laugh that echoed down the street. Her foot slipped on a wet tile she had no hope of navigating, and buckets tipped in her path, sending a harmless cascade of glitter and water in every direction, leaving her looking like a glittery, paint-streaked cartoon villain in the midst of a fully choreographed suburban disaster. The neighbors erupted into uncontrollable laughter, applause, and cheers, some filming every angle, others whispering in awe about how they had never seen such a perfect combination of rage, entitlement, and ridiculous defeat, while Karen, completely overwhelmed, flailed and spun, rolls jiggling violently with each desperate attempt to regain authority, shouting, "I am the HOA president. I am the law. This is harassment," with her double chin bouncing like a drum, but it was hopeless because every movement triggered another absurd consequence. More paint, more glitter, more slippery tiles, and even a strategically placed whoopee cushion that added a soundtrack of comedic flatulence to her flailing. At one point she tried to retreat, but in classic cartoon fashion she stumbled backward into a bucket of glitter, sending herself into a slow-motion tumble across the porch, leaving a trail of humiliation so complete that it could have been painted into a mural titled, "Karen Defeated by Creativity and Suburban Justice." While kids in the neighborhood squealed with delight and mimicked her movements, adults whispered and laughed, and I, sipping lemonade and leaning casually on the fence, watched the culmination of weeks of brilliant planning unfold perfectly, knowing that Karen, soaked, glittered, painted, exhausted, and muttering vague threats, had finally reached the pinnacle of absurd humiliation. By the time she waddled to her car, dripping, streaked, glittered, and defeated beyond reason, the yard, porch, and entire street echoed with laughter, applause, and incredulous whispers, and I realized that the saga of Karen, The very fat, very furious HOA president who thought she could control my property, had reached its perfect conclusion, a story of creativity, humor, and outrageous ingenuity, proving once and for all that no amount of roles, rage, or self-importance could withstand the combined forces of paint, glitter, clever traps, and a suburban warrior determined to defend their home with nothing but imagination and a wicked sense of humor. And as the neighborhood dispersed, still buzzing with laughter and storytelling, I knew this legend would be retold for years, a shining, absurd testament to the fact that sometimes the best way to handle a very fat, very angry HOA tyrant is with paint, patience, and perfectly executed comedic justice.